She didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She didn't even look nervous. She just crossed her arms, sighed like I was wasting her time, and said, "You need to get over it." That was it. That was her reaction to me standing there, shaking, asking if it was true that she'd been seeing someone else. No guilt. No shame. Just irritation. In that exact second, something in my head snapped. Not because she cheated, but because she genuinely didn't care that I was destroyed by it. I remember staring at her, waiting for the follow-up. The remorse. The explanation. Anything human. Instead, she rolled her eyes and said she was tired of going in circles and that I was making it bigger than it needed to be. Bigger? My wife had an affair, admitted it like she was confessing to being late for work, and expected me to swallow it quietly. I felt stupid standing there, realizing I was the only one in the room still fighting for a marriage that had already ended in her mind. That was the moment I understood. The betrayal wasn't just the affair. It was how easily she told me to get over it. Before the cheating, our marriage looked solid from the outside. We weren't flashy or dramatic, but we were stable. At least that's what I told myself. We both worked, paid bills on time, talked about the future like it was a shared project. Weekends were routines, groceries, errands, dinner on the couch. Nothing exciting, but nothing alarming either. I thought that was what long-term marriage turned into. Calm, predictable, safe. I believed we were a team. I listened when she complained about work, supported her decisions, gave her space when she asked for it. I wasn't perfect, but I was present. I never imagined loyalty was something I needed to worry about. She never talked about being unhappy, at least not directly. There were no ultimatums, no big fights, no warnings that something was broken beyond repair. Looking back, that's what makes it hurt more. I didn't ignore a burning house. I trusted a home that felt quiet. And I had no idea that, while I was protecting what we had, she had already started disconnecting from it entirely. The changes didn't arrive like alarms. They slipped in quietly, disguised as mood swings, stress, exhaustion. She started guarding her phone in small ways, turning the screen down, stepping into another room to answer texts. If I asked who it was, she'd say, "Just work," with a tone that made me feel stupid for even asking. I told myself I was being paranoid. She stopped sharing details about her day. Conversations became surface level, efficient, almost transactional. When I tried to joke or flirt, she brushed it off like an inconvenience. Less eye contact, less touch, less warmth. I noticed she laughed more at her screen than with me. But every time the thought crossed my mind that something was off, I shut it down. I didn't want to be the insecure husband reading into nothing. There were nights she stayed out later than usual, claiming overtime or drinks with coworkers. I believed her because believing was easier than confronting the possibility that I was slowly being replaced. Those subtle changes were warning signs, but at the time, they felt too small to challenge. So I ignored them, and that silence cost me everything. The red flags were there, clear as day. I just worked overtime convincing myself they weren't real. She started snapping at me over nothing. How I loaded the dishwasher, how I asked questions, how I needed too much reassurance. When I tried to talk about feeling disconnected, she rolled her eyes and said I was exhausting. I told myself every marriage has rough patches. She became oddly protective of her independence. Suddenly, any mention of us annoyed her. If I suggested spending time together, she'd say, "I'm allowed to have my own life." And somehow, I ended up apologizing for wanting my wife around. I explained it away as her finding herself or going through a phase. The biggest red flag was how easily she dismissed my feelings. When I said something felt wrong, she laughed and told me I was insecure. I believed her. I trusted her version of reality more than my own instincts. Looking back, I wasn't explaining away red flags. I was training myself to ignore the truth. The first real moment it hit me wasn't dramatic. That's what scares me now. It was quiet. Ordinary. We were sitting on the couch one night, the TV on, her phone glowing in her hand. I said her name, once, twice, and she didn't respond. Not because she didn't hear me, but because she didn't care to look up. When she finally did, her expression was flat, almost annoyed, like I'd interrupted something more important. I asked her if everything was okay between us. She sighed, heavy and theatrical, and said, "Why do you always make things a problem?" That sentence landed harder than it should have. I realized in that moment I was alone in the marriage. Not physically, but emotionally. The warmth was gone. The curiosity about me was gone. I wasn't her partner anymore. I was an inconvenience. I remember feeling a cold knot form in my stomach, like my body understood the truth before my mind was ready to accept it. Something was wrong. And deep down, I knew it wasn't temporary. The shift didn't happen all at once. It was gradual, almost strategic. She stopped sharing things with me. Her day, her thoughts, her frustrations. Conversations became transactional. Short answers. No follow-up questions. If I talked about my work or how I was feeling, she'd nod without really listening, already halfway back into her phone. She also started protecting her space in ways she never had before. Passwords changed. Her phone was always face down. If I walked into a room unexpectedly, she'd flinch or lock the screen too quickly, then act irritated like I was the one being suspicious. When I asked why she seemed distant, she'd say I was imagining it. I'm just tired, or you're reading too much into things. What hurt most was the lack of affection. Touch disappeared. No casual hugs, no leaning into me, no warmth. When I reached for her, she pulled away like it was an obligation she resented. I started to feel needy for wanting basic closeness, and she made sure I felt that shame. Looking back, her behavior wasn't random, it was preparation. She was already emotionally gone, and I was the last one to realize it. The lies started small, which almost made them believable. She said she was working late more often, but her paycheck didn't change. She said her phone battery was dying, yet she'd be scrolling minutes later. She told me she was meeting a co-worker from the team, but couldn't remember his last name when I asked casually. Every explanation felt rushed, incomplete, like something patched together on the spot. What really didn't make sense was how defensive she became over harmless questions. If I asked where she'd been, her tone would sharpen instantly. Why are you interrogating me? If I noticed a contradiction and brought it up, she'd accuse me of being paranoid. The stories shifted slightly each time she retold them, details changing just enough to make me doubt my own memory. I started keeping things to myself, replaying conversations in my head late at night. The more I tried to rationalize her words, the more exhausted I became. None of the lies were dramatic on their own, but together they formed a pattern I didn't want to see. Deep down, I knew the truth was there. I just wasn't ready to say it out loud yet. The emotional distance started long before I ever suspected another man. She was still physically there, still sharing the same bed, the same house, but something fundamental was gone. Conversations became transactional. Short answers. No follow-up questions. No curiosity about my day. When I talked, she listened just enough to respond, not enough to care. Affection faded quietly. Hugs felt stiff, like obligations. Kisses were quick, almost clinical. If I reached for her, she'd sigh or pull away slightly, just enough to make me feel like I was asking for too much. When I noticed it and tried to talk about how disconnected we felt, she brushed it off. You're imagining things. We're fine. Every marriage goes through phases. What hurt most was the way she emotionally checked out while insisting nothing was wrong. She stopped confiding in me. Her phone became her refuge. I was no longer the person she vented to, laughed with, or leaned on. I told myself she was stressed, tired, overwhelmed. But the truth was simpler and colder. She was already gone. The affair didn't create the distance. The distance made room for the affair. I didn't catch her in bed with someone else. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, accidental, and somehow worse. I was using our shared laptop to print a document when a message notification popped up. Her name wasn't on it. A man's was. Casual. Familiar. The kind of tone you don't use with a coworker. I told myself not to look. I still looked. The messages weren't explicit at first. Inside jokes. Late-night timestamps. Complaints about me, framed like harmless venting. Then I scrolled. Plans. Deleted threads referenced, but not visible. A photo she never sent me. My stomach dropped in slow motion, like my body was trying to protect my brain from catching up. What hit hardest wasn't the sexual implication, it was the intimacy, the emotional ease. She was giving him the version of herself I'd been begging for. The warmth, the attention, the softness. In that moment, I didn't feel angry. I felt stupid, like the last person in the room to understand what everyone else already knew. I didn't plan the confrontation. It just spilled out of me that same night, sitting across from her at the kitchen table like we were discussing groceries. I told her I'd seen the messages. I expected panic, denial, tears, something human. She didn't even flinch. She leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and sighed like I'd just accused her of forgetting to take out the trash. So, she said. One word. Flat. Bored. That was the moment my chest tightened. I asked her how long it had been going on. She shrugged. Actually shrugged. A while. I asked if it was physical. She hesitated just long enough to answer honestly, then said yes. No apology. No rush to explain. Just facts, delivered without emotion. I remember asking why. That was my mistake. She looked at me like I was slow and said, because I needed something different. Not him. Not a mistake. Something different. I told her she destroyed our marriage. She shook her head and replied, "You're being dramatic." That was the second punch. The first was the cheating. The second was realizing she didn't care enough to pretend she was sorry. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She didn't even try to justify herself in a dramatic way. That's what made it worse. Her reaction was pure indifference. When I told her I couldn't believe how calm she was, she rolled her eyes and said, "What do you want me to do? Beg?" Then she added, almost annoyed, "It already happened." I asked her if she felt anything, guilt, regret, shame. She stared at me for a second and answered honestly, "No, I don't." No hesitation. No softening the blow. Just no. She said I was blowing it out of proportion, that people cheat all the time, that I needed to get over it. Hearing those words from my own wife felt unreal. Like I was talking to someone who had already emotionally left months ago. When I told her I was broken by this, she accused me of trying to manipulate her with emotions. When I said I needed space, she laughed and said, "You always do this." That's when it hit me. The affair hurt, but her dismissiveness was the real betrayal. Cheating showed she crossed a line. Her reaction showed she didn't care that the line ever existed. I didn't fall apart right away. It happened later, alone, when the house went quiet and there was no one left to perform for. I sat on the edge of the bed staring at the wall, replaying her words on a loop. Get over it. Like what she did was a spilled drink, not the destruction of a marriage. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't get a full breath. I kept thinking there had to be something I missed, some hidden remorse, some delayed reaction. But the truth was brutal. That calm, dismissive version of her was real. The woman I loved was already gone. I remember shaking, not crying yet, just shaking. My mind kept bouncing between anger and disbelief. I blamed myself. Maybe I wasn't enough. Maybe I failed somehow. That's what she wanted me to think. That's what I had been trained to think. When the tears finally came, they weren't dramatic. They were quiet, exhausted, empty. It felt like mourning someone who was still alive, but emotionally dead. That night, something inside me broke. Not loudly, not all at once, but enough that I knew I'd never see her, or our marriage, the same way again. The decision didn't come from strength. It came from exhaustion. I realized I was tired of explaining my pain to someone who didn't care enough to listen. Tired of asking questions she brushed off. Tired of hoping for remorse that was never coming. I caught myself one morning reaching for my phone, about to send her another message, another attempt to make her understand what she'd done. And then it hit me. Every time I chased clarity, she gained power. Every time I begged for empathy, I lost a little more of myself. So I stopped. I didn't announce it. I didn't make a dramatic speech. I just withdrew. I answered only what was necessary. I stopped trying to decode her moods. I stopped asking why. The silence felt strange at first, almost wrong, like I was abandoning something. But slowly, it started to feel like relief. For the first time since discovering the cheating, my energy stayed with me. Not with fixing her. Not with saving the marriage alone. With me. And in that quiet decision, to stop chasing someone who had already walked away, I felt the first hint of control return. At first, the distance felt artificial, like I was pretending not to care when I clearly still did. We lived in the same space, crossed paths in the kitchen, exchanged short, empty sentences. But emotionally, we were already miles apart. I stopped sharing my thoughts, stopped reacting to her tone, stopped trying to read between the lines of what she said and what she avoided. She noticed the change, not because she missed me, but because I was no longer feeding the dynamic she was used to. When I didn't argue, she seemed irritated. When I didn't ask questions, she looked almost confused. My detachment removed the mirror she used to justify herself. Inside, something was shifting. The anger cooled. The sadness dulled. What replaced it wasn't happiness, it was clarity. I no longer saw her as the woman I was trying to win back, but as someone who had made a clear choice and expected me to adapt to it. Distance stopped being punishment. It became protection. And with every day I stayed emotionally removed, I felt less tied to the version of the marriage that no longer existed. Looking back now, the cheating wasn't the moment everything truly ended. That happened later, when she told me to get over it, and meant it. That was the instant I understood something fundamental. Betrayal hurts, but indifference destroys. Cheating can come from weakness, impulse, or selfish desire. But dismissing the pain you caused? That's a choice. I spent too long believing that if I explained myself better, loved harder, stayed calmer, she would suddenly care. She never did. And that's the lesson I wish I'd learned sooner. You cannot negotiate empathy. You cannot earn remorse from someone who doesn't believe they owe it to you. If you're reading this and your partner cheated, listen carefully to how they react. Not their excuses, not their apologies, their attitude. When someone tells you to get over their betrayal, believe what that says about them. Love without accountability becomes manipulation. Loyalty without respect becomes self-betrayal. The moment I stopped chasing her validation was the moment I got my dignity back. And that, more than anything, is where healing actually began.